1986 and 1987 saw three epic films on the Vietnam War: Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and Hamburger Hill. And we're talking about all three of them today on Reckoning with Jason Herbert. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning. So wait, here's the thing that happens. I'll be talking and I'll say your name, and then inevitably someone will say, "Oh, I know Waitman Beorn." And that is exactly what happened. John and I are doing like a live pod in Missouri like 3 weeks ago, and I do your rivet counting thing that I'm always constantly quoting. He goes, "Yeah, I know Waitman." I'm like, "You do? What's up?" So welcome back, my friends, to Reckoning. We're no longer historians of the movies. We're now an angrier, sultrier version of this podcast. So
sultry, I like that.
I try to keep it up. I'm geeked out. I've been thinking about this movie for the longest time. I just texted my childhood best friend. I remember watching this movie when I was like 10 years old, and we were like in the 1980s, like all the little boys in Kentucky, we were all watching Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, every Chuck Norris film. We could talk about like how Vietnam gets filtered through pop culture in a little while, but I mean, this was required learning as a child. And I feel like in some ways this film may have been even more rewatchable than the others. Sometimes whenever I think about it, I just texted Jesse. I was like, "Hey, we're doing Hamburger Hill." He's like, "Hell yeah!" So I'm stoked to talk to you guys about this. We can talk about all kinds of films and so forth and get into it. But before we do so, let's introduce you guys for the listeners and kind of go from there. John, you were here first. You wanna say hi and tell us who you are and what you're doing here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm John C. McManus. I'm a Courage Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology, where Jason just visited a few weeks ago. It was a blast having him there. And as he mentioned, we did basically a live version of our collective podcasts, just talking movies, just doing what we do. So it was really cool. That was the first time I met Jason. I'd known Waitman for years. He may not want to admit that he's known me for that long, but
no way.
I've known him for years, and he's a great dude.
Wait, how about you, dude? Who has known John longer than me?
Like half the time, I don't know why I'm here, but I'm always happy to be here. I'm like 7-Eleven. I might not always be selling, but I'm always.
You're a
open.
Sure thing, baby.
I don't know. So I'm in real life, I'm a Holocaust historian, but Jason gives me like one Holocaust movie every like 7.
Because there's so much fun to talk about. Wait,
because nobody wants to listen to somebody talk about the Holocaust for
some
of
Vietnam.
So I'm kind of adjacent to war movie. I mean, I like war movies. I was in the military. I guess that's my entree here. I feel like I'm kind of the color commentary and John's kind of the play-by-play guy, so maybe we'll do it that way. But no, it's fun. I mean, and I, the older I get, the more I appreciate the ways that film tells us an awful lot about the time when the film was made as well, and kind of about myths and stereotypes and caricatures that we have of the past. And so when I rewatched this one, there's a lot of things that jumped out, which hopefully we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, so we put that pod that John and I did live. I got messages like, "So Dr. McManus knows his stuff." I was like, "Yeah." It's like you try staying on. It's like you try staying on stage with the guy for an hour and a half. I was like, I was just trying to bring my A game. I was just trying to stay afloat there. But I'm giddy, right? Because this film is important. Like this is sometimes, throughout the course of this pod that we've been doing now for like 3 years, sometimes we've kind of wrestled with this idea like, what's a history film, right? But this is very, very much, very directly a history movie, kind of trying to talk about this very specific battle during the conflict. and so forth. But like you're saying, Waitman, like we've talked about this so many of these films are really about the time in which they're being made, that I kind of felt like this was the perfect time to kind of talk about it. And I've always felt like Hamburger Hill kind of gets forgotten about. It's that third of the trilogy of films that comes out between Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and then Hamburger Hill. But of course, there's a whole lot of other Vietnam War films coming out then around them. But it really kind of feels like it sometimes doesn't get the attention maybe it deserves. I don't know, John. I mean, what are your thoughts on this when you think about Hamburger Hill when it comes to think about Vietnam War films in general?
I think it's in the shadows. Just it's kind of similar to Thin Red Line with Saving Private Ryan, that had the misfortune of coming out later that same year, and it didn't have the same kind of publicity and promotion around it. Though obviously it's a big movie, and so it had that. But it kind of reminds me, it's on the heels of Platoon. And I mean, just Platoon sucked out all the oxygen, even more so than Full Metal Jacket on some level. Although Stanley Kubrick, as the director, I think brought some eyeballs to it that maybe it otherwise wouldn't have had. But I mean, Hamburger Hill. What I like about it is that it's a veteran-centered movie. Jim Karabatsos obviously was a Vietnam veteran, and so he understood a lot that I think many others wouldn't. Just like Oliver Stone, of course, knew a lot that others wouldn't in Platoon, and it had been years in the making for him. So I really like how the movie starts. Showing the wall, the Vietnam Memorial Wall in D.C. and juxtaposing that against just a anonymous firefight going on, and that's how you're introduced to the whole thing. I think that's really, really absorbing in a good way.
And of course, the director, John Irvin, was also a documentary filmmaker in Vietnam. He did films, so when we get to the part where we sort of not count rivets, but start talking about kind of adherence to or departures from sort of reality, it's interesting that so many of those people, and the producer, I forget her name, but the producer's son had served in Vietnam. So there's a whole, lineage of people directly involved in making this film that had been in Vietnam. Whereas Platoon, you sort of get Oliver Stone's version of Bravo Company that he was in, and of course there's a book. I remember this because somebody gave me this book when I was a kid, and it was the true story of Bravo Company, whatever unit he was in, because Robert people got really mad at Oliver Stone's portrayal of soldiers in Vietnam, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have too about, how do soldiers in Vietnam come off in these two movies? Because I think it's fundamentally different than it does in Vietnam, or in Platoon rather. There's an edge to Platoon, I think, in the sense of commenting on the kinds of people that are in Vietnam that's harsher perhaps than the edge in Hamburger Hill.
Yeah, and I remember, and going back and looking at the promotional materials for this, they were really building this. This is almost like a proto Saving Private Ryan in some ways, that they were really trying to hammer home the idea that this is the authentic experience of Vietnam. That was really kind of their driving edge. And I kind of wonder if by 1987, John, if people were kind of Vietnamed out after getting hit with Platoon and then Full Metal Jacket, and just, because the film doesn't do as well at the time. And I'm kind of wondering if maybe we're just people okay, I'm ready to move on to Teen Wolf 2 or something, at this point in time.
Yeah, I think at that point, I mean, it capitalizes on this whole, absorption with Vietnam that so predominated, in the early mid 80s onward. But it's offering us some level of authenticity after the whole Rambo experience and missing in action experience and all that kind of stuff. And it is, I think Waitman's point is really good in terms of how the soldiers are portrayed. Oliver Stone's Platoon is kind of a parable that he's created that's trying to tell you something about who served in Vietnam. And the theme is kind of the poor are there doing the fighting, the rich are, somehow profiting from this or something, and it's all about how we're fighting one another and not the enemy, and it's brilliantly done on many levels. But really, it's I don't as someone who teaches a Vietnam War course, I don't see it as particularly authentic in terms of what really would have gone on in the dynamics of a rifle platoon in Vietnam, of guys killing each other and and that kind of. It's
I mean, there's a bit of a Scooby-Doo element to Hamburger Hill, but I think it's actually probably more realistically true in the sense of like we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but like the divisions within the platoon, racial, new guy versus experienced person, etc. Like they're there and they're very real, but ultimately most of the folks get over it and sort of are bonded by the experience, which I think is actually probably more realistic than the platoon version, where even when Charlie Sheen's character sort of becomes welcome to the platoon, the black white divide is sort of like insurmountable there, for example, and that it's a platoon, it's a group of individuals and cliques in a way that the platoon that's presented in Hamburger Hill, I think, isn't. And I think that the Hamburger Hill version is probably, more realistic without going into the, that, war makes us all brothers and we all hang out afterwards, which is absolutely not the case. But I think it does represent sort of in the moment, a collective sort of suffering that actually does create a bond, I guess, in the way that Platoon sort of doesn't.
John, I got a question for you. You teach a Vietnam War course, and I'm kind of wondering, we're 60 years now removed from, say, really 1965. Like, what do your students who are walking into that class know about Vietnam? Are there preconceptions that students have, or is this, we kind of grew up in the shadow of it, but I'm kind of wondering, what are today's students walking in knowing about Vietnam? Do they know anything at all, or what?
I'm amazed how much they know about the culture, the era, like the music. So one of the things I do for that class that I don't for any other is before class starts, I'll play music from the era, and not just like general music, but like, in other words, something that's real popular in 65 is played earlier, when we're covering that, not 1970, because music changes too, of course. And so I'm amazed how familiar they are with a lot of the music, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the just everything of the era, the 60s and 70s. They don't always know, of course, the nuts and bolts of the Vietnam War and how it happens, but the sort of default setting, I think, for them and really for American popular culture is this was a horrible thing, never should have happened, and God, how could they be so stupid? Which to me, I'd say as an educator gets us nowhere, because obviously we know how it turned out and we know the issues. What gets us somewhere is to go back and say, okay, here's the series of choices policymakers had. There's going to be a lot of consequences no matter what you do. It's a matter of what's the least bad decision for the least bad outcome in a way, because we also, I think I would understand if they decide not to get involved in Vietnam, there's going to be serious domestic consequences here. You're on the heels of McCarthyism and all this kind of stuff. You're going to have some issues in that respect, but same time, we know how it turns out too. So I like to really present that conundrum, like, okay, here are your terrible options. What do you do? And I think then that kind of grounds them on this whole thing. And the really frightening thing is that a lot of times they go on and make the same decisions. And it's like, that's frightening, but I think it's also kind of illuminating. You maybe get a little understanding more than you might have had dismissing the whole thing and saying, oh, misbegotten, stupid. Aren't they dumb?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, and probably the same with God, I mean, with folks our students' age. I mean, the whole Iraq-Afghanistan thing it's right there too. Like mm-hmm. Soldiers sitting in a foreign country going, "What the heck am I doing here?" We're not seeming making any progress, et cetera. I mean.
And nobody wants to be seen soft on communism or being seen soft mm-hmm. on the global war on terror. I mean, it's almost low-hanging fruit. In which the parallels are so similar between, say, those two particular conflicts.
Yeah,
I want to ask you, like, John, as we jump into this film, this film opens up on 10 May 1969. Where is the war in 1969? Like, can you give us kind of a state of the war at this point in time? Like, what's going on?
In terms of American military involvement, it's really at about its apex. You're going to have, I think, 543,000 American service personnel in Vietnam as of 1969. You're after the Tet Offensive of 1968, and the reason I say that is there's another one that the communists launched in 1969, which is also equally unsuccessful. but also does damage and continues the incredible ferocity of the conflict. And at that point, attrition is definitely cutting both ways. So you've had years of this go on. You've got a completely new commander of what's called MACV, Military Assistance or Advisory Command Vietnam. You'll hear both. William Westmoreland has been essentially kind of fired by getting kicked upstairs in June 1968 to become Army Chief of Staff. His West Point classmate, Creighton Abrams, has taken over, and the idea is he's not going to run these big unit operations such as we'd had earlier in the war, the idea being to wear down the communists, and yet you still have this kind of institutional momentum for that in MACV of destroying the NVA wherever you can find them. And the pattern that you've had earlier in the war, which I would argue you really see at a much greater and more ferocious level 2 years earlier at Dak To, is NVA conventional forces kind of massing along the border areas, wanting us, in a way, to go out there and fight them and ending up in these terrible hill fights where we see the hill, we take the hill, we suffer horrible casualties, and then we move on and we let them have it back. And there's this sense of terrible deja vu and frustration. So I think Hamburger Hill or Dong Ap Bia, Hill 972, whatever you want to call it, in May 1969 is something of a redo of Dak To and some of these earlier hill fights. It's happening in the context, too, of the communist domination of what's called the Aishao Valley, which is a major transit point and supply point and movement point and, domination point, near the Laotian border. And this has been a problem for years. So this isn't anything new by May 69. It's just a new unit, not a new unit, but I'm saying a new group that's having to deal with this versus others in other spots.
We talk a little bit about this idea of attrition and so forth, right? About just going out and seeking out the enemy, if you will, and destroying them wherever you find them. Look, I hate to do this, John, but doesn't this feel reckless looking back? I mean, the amount of casualties the Americans are suffering during this conflict, this stuff's getting reported back home. I mean, what's a response to this strategy on back in the homeland?
Well, I mean, I think there's a dual response that's really grown quite powerful by this point in time. There's the sort of classic anti-war movement that is deeply opposed to the war, certainly on a moral basis, but in some cases on a pragmatic basis too, of saying this isn't working or, we shouldn't be there. The war's misbegotten. It's horrible what we're doing. We're killing Vietnamese. It needs to stop, of course. So this has gotten much worse by 1969. And obviously you've had all the upheaval and tumult of 1968 that has, basically led Johnson to have to leave office. And you're in the middle of this initial sort of, such as it is, honeymoon for the new Nixon administration in spring 1969, which they've quickly sabotaged by surreptitiously bombing Cambodia, which comes out around this time in the New York Times. And so this really has a lot of consequences going forward. But the other side of opposition to the war that is pertinent to our discussion of Hamburger Hill, I would say, is what I think we tend to forget is the hawkishly opposed to the war. In other words, hawks who say, yeah, we need to defeat the commies, but this isn't the way to do it. You're making our guys fight with one hand behind their back, either win this thing or get out. And that's a big part of the momentum against the war, too. Of course, they have nothing in common with the more left-wing opposition to the war, but they end up in something in the same place, get us out. That's the irony of it all.
So, John, quick question. What impact does Nixon's sort of intimations by this period? Because I think it's in June or July, he basically makes it clear that he's trying to get out of the war. And so like people are reading the tea leaves also, which I think filters down at some level when we think about this film, because nobody wants to be the last guy killed, in the war, and so now it's also you're stuck in this. We're trying to get out of this war now, but now we're fighting for essentially clout and leverage in the negotiations, rather than trying necessarily to sort of bring a strategic end to the war in our favor.
Yeah, I mean, and what's interesting, Wade, is that this isn't really new. I mean, a decade plus earlier, we got the same thing going on in Korea, just really with a more conventional centered fight. But you have, for instance, in the spring of '53, the Battle of Pork Chop Hill, which is all about that whole thing of we're at the negotiating table and we have to demonstrate to them that we will continue to fight and lose people in order to get what we want out of the peace. Well, Nixon, who was, of course, involved in all that, with as a young guy when he was vice president for Eisenhower. Now here he is, president, in a similar position in the sense, like you said, not wanting to be the last guy killed because he's going to be de-escalating, and that's the interesting thing about the '68 election is that both major party candidates made it clear they were going to pursue de-escalation, and Hubert Humphrey is kind of saddled with association with Johnson and his policies, but that's what he was probably going to do, and so was Nixon. So it's a matter of how we do that, and so I've always felt that's another side of the Vietnam War that I think tends to be misunderstood. This sort of determinism that it was always going to turn out the way it did, that you couldn't have salvaged anything. And I don't really think that's quite true. And so I think that the Nixon administration is after some sort of chip they're going to have at the negotiating table to bring about some level of security for South Vietnam going forward. And they also envisioned it too in the longer sweep that the Americans would be involved in supporting South Vietnam, similar to what we do with South Korea after the end of that war. How are they going to envision that you're going to have Watergate happen and Nixon's going to be gone, and you'll then have on the heels of that so much anti-war sentiment that we just sort of pull the plug on South Vietnam altogether, and we're so disgusted with the corruption there and the repression, all these things we didn't like about the Saigon regime. So these guys who are fighting in Hamburger Hill in 1969 are sort of the pawns in the middle of this whole mess. And what's interesting too, that, like you mentioned, not wanting to be the last guy killed. I mean, you see that in World War II as well, a victorious war. So imagine this situation where you don't know what you're doing there, or what's going to happen next, or how the hell we get out of this. It's just really, I think, when you look at these characters and portrayed in the movie, you get a sense that they're buffeted by these forces. And I don't know about you guys, but I just feel really badly for them. It's like, what a hell of a spot to be in.
Well, I guess one of the questions I got for you, John, is what was the Vietnamese, what was North Vietnam's strategies and intentions there? Because I don't want to focus, say, solely on the American. We see the American viewpoint in this film, right? But I think it's really important that we talk about, like, look, these people were fighting for their own independence, their own autonomy, and their own national direction. But what was the plan? You're taking on the quote-unquote most powerful nation in the history of the world. What's the plan on the part of North Vietnam?
I mean, that's the other thing too. I'm glad you mentioned that because, I mean, they've been beaten up for years. They've suffered casualties, the likes of which are I think, beyond our level of understanding. And I mean, it's just horrendous. The draft calls that are going on in North Vietnam for young men. And by the way, you have the same dynamic there as you have in the U.S., where sometimes wealthy and powerful people get their sons out of the draft and have, deferments and all that. The same thing was going on in North Vietnam with the wired in party guys were sending a lot of their sons to other places in the communist bloc to be educated so that they wouldn't have to fight. So there's sort of ironically kind of a class dimension there. And the level of losses they have been absolutely devastating, but it has not altered the will of that government in Hanoi to get the outcome they want, which, of course, is to conquer the South and unite the country under their control. They have support, enough of it, from China and the Soviet Union that this allows them to logistically sustain and supply themselves and have enough weaponry. And there's not necessarily a lot of grassroots opposition in North Vietnam. Where you've seen it play out, though, in terms of a decline in their war effort is in the Viet Cong. In South Vietnam, there aren't as many grassroots guys joining the Viet Cong after the Tet Offensive '68 because the casualties they absorbed were horrible. And so on the U.S. South Vietnamese side, you were getting a little more influence in the countryside. Ultimately, not enough, but the Viet Cong was not quite what it had been before. It's still there, but you're seeing this sort of interesting kind of tipping point in the war, these next 3 years, 69 to 72, in which it kind of goes back and forth as to who has more sway in the countryside. And I think the pattern tends to be the Saigon influence is getting better. And so if you are one of those North Vietnamese soldiers fighting at Hamburger Hill, what you think probably is that, you can inflict losses on the Americans. You can humiliate them with a defeat to deny them control of the hill. and work toward this greater, quite idealistic goal of uniting the country. You're thinking you're liberating your southern countrymen from imperialists, and that's Hanoi's take.
And it's worth pointing out too, I think, again, like the movie, many movies, Platoon does this too. The enemy is this kind of like cookie cutter, like central casting, random Vietnamese person, with no character, no backstory, etc. But in this context, the NVA, the PAVN, right, the North Vietnamese regulars, like this is the battle they wanted. Like they planned to have this battle. This wasn't like, the Americans got one on them. They knew the Americans wanted to go there, and they sent this I think it's the 29th division, the regiment, which is like the pride of Ho Chi Minh, right, with the name of the regiment, which actually had been fighting the 101st South in Three Corps land earlier, and then basically got pulled to the north because it got wrecked. And so, ironically, it's really a lot of new guys and some hardcore veterans, which is really interesting because if you listen to a lot of like the veterans' testimonies, they talk about how they're up against this really elite NVA regiment, which they really weren't. This was a bunch of sort of NVA new guys as well. But the point is that, we walked into their house where they wanted us to be, which is never a place that you want to be in war. Like, you never want to be fighting on the ground of the enemy's choosing where they want you to be there. And they had the whole thing set up the way they wanted it to be. And they weren't sort of this stereotype of kind of poorly equipped, people by the, fighting by the skin of their pants or whatever. I mean, like they were very well equipped. They were very well dug in. They survived stupid amounts of bombing and artillery, and it was only just sort of sheer stubbornness and bullheadedness, and of course the bravery of soldiers that won that battle. But this wasn't sort of a Ya Drang kind of meeting engagement where both sides kind of stumble into each other. This was here's where we want you to come and we're ready for you to come here, which I think also explains why it's such a horrendous fight, because you're walking into the jaws of where the enemy wants you to be in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, this is precisely where they want you. And basically what they want is they want a redo of Hill 875 at Dak To almost 2 years earlier. Now they're going to do it differently at 1969 versus 67. They're not going to try and cut off the Americans and all that. They're just going to hunker down in beautifully prepared positions. And yeah, I think what's really moving about this from a North Vietnamese point of view is to think about how many people they had lost by now. I mean, how many? I mean, well into six figures in terms of killed and wounded. People who are missing to this day. I mentioned the Tet Offensive from the year before. And, there's about 84,000 communist troops in play in that offensive. By the end of the year, half of them are dead. So imagine that. If you're like Waite was saying, that 29th Regiment, I mean, most of these guys are going to be new by 1969. And if you're one of the veterans, what you've been through by this point in time to still survive after all these years of war. And I think it's very hard for Americans to wrap their minds around that, because that's even in Vietnam, as much as the casualty rates can be pretty bad at times, it never really compares to the losses.
I mean, this is something that I flagged when I was watching it, because I'm watching the movie and I'm just watching guys get like killed right and left. American soldiers are falling all over the place, and I'm like, Jesus, like this is awful. And then I go to the Wikipedia and I actually downloaded the AR, the Army's After Action Report. And when I say only, obviously, but only 70 people are killed in this battle. Right now, again, that's a lot, but like in terms of like orders of magnitude, it's if we think about John, World War II, Korea, that's like a Tuesday, but I mean, I mentioned that again, not to minimize the losses, but to show sort of where American tolerance is kind of regulated for what constitutes kind of like a bloody engagement. Now that's killed, there's like something at 400 plus wounded. So we're talking like 70% of the battalion is out of action, which is actually crazy. But in terms of like actual people killed, again, even compared to, as John was pointing out, compared to the Vietnamese, or compared to our previous, wars. I mean, it's not like it's not the Little Bighorn. I mean, in terms of like massacre, it's 70 people, which is obviously that's too many, and it's all sort of a terrible loss given the war. But compared to what the Vietnamese are losing or what we lost in World War II, et cetera, I think it tells you how sensitive the public is both then and in watching the film. And one of the things that really struck me, and I'll be quiet, but in June 1969, Life magazine publishes this spread called something like "The Faces of the American War Dead in Vietnam." Yep. So it's literally like the month after the battle, and there are some people in that spread who were killed at Hamburger Hill, but most of them weren't. But a lot of the American sort of public opinion kind of looked at this and associated these two things, because it's literally, you can find it online. And I spent an entire evening looking at random people and then looking their names up and learning the story of how they were killed and where they were killed and that kind of stuff. And I highly recommend anybody that has a moment to do that, because it highlights sort of the loss and the expanse of the killing. But most of these guys weren't killed at Hamburger Hill, but the association becomes, the faces of the dead, just page after page after page. And again, one of the centers of gravity, I think, and maybe John can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Vietnam, one of the centers of gravity for the North Vietnamese is American public opinion. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in the like, we lost the war because our hands are tied behind our back, but they recognize that the Americans were only willing to suffer so many losses, and that it would reach a certain point where things would become untenable. And I think that was part of their strategy is inflict losses, and then make the Americans leave, because the Americans ultimately don't care about Vietnam the way the North Vietnamese care about Vietnam.
I think John brings up a really important point here too. And we never see this on the screen, right? But we think about the losses suffered by people in Vietnam, whether North or South Vietnam, right? And you've got a decades-long rebuilding process after this, because when you lose young men, right, and certainly women died in this conflict as well, but you lose those soldiers, right? You're not just losing soldiers, you're losing husbands and fathers. And when this war is over, you're losing laborers and teachers and thinkers, and like you're losing component pieces of society that are necessary for the continuation of that society, right? You take this in addition to things like Agent Orange, which has this incredibly long-lasting effect on the peninsula as well. It's like, this is a devastating war for the Vietnamese people to have to overcome after the war is over.
Yeah, I mean, you have the effects of Agent Orange, like you said, that goes on for generations. Also, unexploded ordnance.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's probably even deadlier. And that's not just, of course, Vietnam. That's Laos and Cambodia too. They're a big part of the whole conflict. It's yeah. I mean, it's a long shadow and a long legacy, and also too the post-American War conflicts that the Socialist Republic of Vietnam is going to have, the United Vietnam that comes out of the war, invading Cambodia, being invaded by China. You've got a counterinsurgency against the Khmer Rouge that goes on for into the 1990s. Arguably still isn't quite done on some level. I mean, it's really kind of sobering to think of this. And of course, put that alongside the fighting that had happened before the American involvement in Vietnam, obviously the French war in Vietnam, the war against the Japanese, in which, by a conservative estimate, probably at least 250,000 to 500,000 Vietnamese starve in 44 and 45 because of a Japanese authored famine. I mean, it's just horrible to think of. If you were to go back to, say, 1932 and tell a Vietnamese person, this is the 60 some odd years you've got ahead of you, they may say, I want to check out, or I want to go somewhere else, because horrible times were ahead,
Can I ask you guys, we've got this one other group to talk about specifically, which is this, and John knows that I want to talk about them, the 101st. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, and Murray, Kentucky, close to Fort Campbell. My entire family's from Hoptown in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is stone's throw away from Fort Campbell. John, can we talk about who the 101st is? And like why are they always on screen, John?
They are the glamour boys of the United States Army on many levels, and the biggest reason is, of course, Band of Brothers, which portrays the 101st. They're just, I mean, they're just cool, maybe on some level too, but obviously the 101st had compiled an incredible record in World War II. And, you know, obviously they're paratroopers. They are, you know, there's the whole airborne mentality, even though, of course, by Vietnam, it's an air assault division and had been transitioned, I think, in the late 50s. They just endure in popular memory because they're on iconic battlefields like Normandy, Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, of course, Market Garden in Netherlands, and then of course Hamburger Hill and many other places in Vietnam. And of course, projecting forward, we have the 21st century as well. But I think it's Band of Brothers as much as anything that really puts them front and center. But you know, with having said that, I mean, this is well before Bands of Brothers. Hamburger Hill came out in 1987, but it just, in this case, I think it just so happened that this was the unit that was involved, you know, in that fight. What's interesting though too is that you know, the actual subunit, the 187th, was not part of the 101st in World War II. So that's a post World War II thing. That's the Rakkasans, and they have an amazing history themselves. So now they become part of the 101st, and the 101st have done a lot of fighting in, especially like in 2 Corps, which is where this whole thing goes on, like 2 Corps and I Corps up in that neighborhood in South Vietnam. The 101st has seen some pretty hard fighting already in the war from 65 or 66, excuse me, onward. So yeah, it's as I see it, they're sort of the glamour boys. I don't know. What do you guys think?
They've got a good PR department. Just ask them.
They do.
I mean, I was curious though too when I was watching, you know, because you know, some of the guys show up as replacements. And I was listening to some veterans' testimony, veteran telling their stories, and they showed up as replacements. Like, how many of these guys have gone through the whole, you know, like air assault, you're part of the 101st training, and how many of them had just sort of like gone through basic infantry training and like Tigerland at Fort Polk and then been dumped into the 101st in a way that the Band of Brothers isn't, right? Where Band of Brothers, you have like, you guys are all elite, we're all elite together from the beginning, et cetera, et cetera. And Vietnam is, you know, you just sort of are dropped in there.
Yeah, it's like, congratulations, you're playing for Kentucky now. You know, it's like you're getting put on like you're getting put almost like on the legacy team, just right initially.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, that's got to give you some pride, and it's a, you know, a force multiplier. But my impression with these guys is that they have been through jump school, that they, you know, they are actual paratroopers. Which then, to me, if you think about it, that means they're volunteers on some level. Because if you're an average draftee going through Tigerland and, you know, going to Vietnam, you don't have to go through jump school. So I think that's what's kind of interesting about it, is that there had to be some point where these guys did volunteer for a unit that wasn't going to be like any other unit in Vietnam. You have the machine gunner, Beanstalk, says that he volunteered, you know. And it's also interesting too to note that he's the one who gets the Dear John letter from his girlfriend saying that it's, you know, her friends think it's immoral to write to him. So maybe there was a whole backstory there, that, you know, she didn't want him to go. He did for whatever reason, and now here he is. But even someone like Doc Johnson, who seems to be the most reluctant guy there on some level, maybe he had to have volunteered too. And he even says, you remember when he's you know, badly wounded and is about to be medevac, he says, "Who are we?" And so he draws back on that pride of being Screaming Eagles. And that's very interesting to me as a historian who, you know, obviously a lot of times focuses on history of units and understands a little bit about how that matters. It's just kind of interesting to me they portrayed that in that moment. Doc Johnson, who's probably the most cynical of them all, for reasons that I think are pretty easy to sympathize with and understand. I mean, you can only imagine what he might have gone through dealing with Jim Crow and all that back home. Here he is, though, saying, "Who are we? We're the Screaming Eagles." Even Doc Johnson, he's not saying, "Oh, screw that. That's nonsense. That's a bill of goods they sold us." There's nothing like that. No, there's still that identity that he's got.
You know what, the one thing, John, that I noticed, and this is not rivet counting, it's just kind of like, I thought it was interesting, and I don't know if there's any truth to it, but in the beginning, in one part of the movie, they're all wearing their little like carabiners with like with their ropes on there, and I'm just like, really? Like, like, are they really going to be walking through the jungle with their little like ropes hanging on? Like, it was like they're pieces of flair for being in the air assault division, and I'm just kind of like, maybe they did, but and we can talk about air assault because actually I think air assault's way more useful than airborne, but. I think Doc Johnson. One of the questions. I'm going to skip ahead.
Please, I want to talk about Courtney B. Vance anyway.
Yeah, one of the things you asked was like, so who steals the show?
100%.
And I think what's really funny is if you look at the IMDb or whatever of this movie, it shows like it's got John Cheadle in it and like other guys, but actually the best character in this entire movie is Courtney Vance's character,
without question.
And it's because. And I think this gets to what John was talking about earlier in terms of suffering, and this is after all the other stuff with like Jim Crow and the racial problems. Is like I think medics in war suffer more than anybody else anyway, because they're kind of like a fireman with a teacup running around a burning building. Like their whole job is to like save life. They value the sanctity of life. They've been taught the ways in which the body functions and how to save people's lives. And all that they're doing is trying to patch up other people destroying that, in horrible ways. And I think you see that with Vance's character throughout the film, where and of course everybody loves him because everybody always loves the medics for obvious reasons. But also, he is suffering because of all the other people in the platoon on the battlefield, like whose job it is to kill and, do whatever. His job isn't to do that. And, medics never really win, like they might say, but more often than not, they're not able to save people, and I think that his character is one of the most emotionally sort of striking of the characters in the film.
Well, there's that great scene after Mac dies. When France is going at Doc saying, why didn't you pull him off the line? And he's like, I got guys sick, so sick they couldn't go in a hospital. And it's just, Courtney, he is just swinging for the fences in this film. And he's just so, the toothbrush scene. When I go back to think about this film,
scene's amazing.
It's almost always the first person I think about is Doc. Just doing these line and maybe it's just Courtney B. Vance, and I'm, golly, what is it I'm thinking about? The Broadway play that he did with James Earl Jones that Denzel ended up doing, and I can't remember the name of it at the time. But Vance is classically trained. He's just so incredibly good at this. There's him and also Steven Weber, I think, gives that great line, gives these great stories towards the end. Can we talk though a little bit about this film goes to R&R like immediately. We're introduced and then we're right back into R&R all of a sudden. And that's not typically what we see in these war films. And I kind of want to talk, John, I lived in Wichita for 5 years and I learned then and there that there is a very large Vietnamese population. Like you can get good food in Wichita, Kansas because the Vietnamese diaspora. Can we talk a little bit about relationships between American soldiers, Vietnamese women? Are these like real relationships, or is it entirely about having a good time? Like, what happens? Are there marriages that happened here? Like, and what happens after the war to these relationships and these families?
I think that's really well portrayed. Actually, you see the kind of ambivalence in the relationship. Of course, in the real war, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of relationships. There were all sorts of people who married Vietnamese and Vietnamese who then came here and made lives for themselves. And of course, the much darker undercurrent too are all sorts of American servicemen who fathered children who were basically abandoned there. And then were really kind of ostracized in Vietnamese society because they were mixed race. We think of American racism in the war, and there's plenty of that, obviously, but there's a lot of Vietnamese racism too, mainly against Montagnards, different tribes there, but also the idea of being pure Vietnamese. And then you have these kids who are either, half white or half black, whatever. There they are living in the midst of other kids, how tough that would be for them. So you have that in terms of real life. Yeah. But like how this is all portrayed on screen, you see the kid who runs after the column trying to sell cokes. I mean, that that is absolutely ubiquitous of these little entrepreneurs anywhere you'd go. All sorts of really interesting accounts of from veterans who were like, yeah, we were out on an operation. We thought we were so stealth, and no one was around, and then we'd basically just take a break, and all of a sudden here comes some kids out of nowhere trying to sell us stuff. And I thought that was kind of funny how they portrayed that, and of course. When they go to the brothel, which obviously is ubiquitous in Vietnam, that kind of ambivalence that you see there. I mean, here are the two women with Sergeant Worcester in France. Great, they're with them, but there's she says you're effing war, and he takes offense to it. My effing war. I'm here fighting for you, and we know more about Worcester later on. We get a sense too why he feels this way because of what's happened to him when he redeployed home. And you remember, by the way, guys, when he talks about how I was medevaced after Dak To. Now there was a hill, and I'm so glad they put that in there because Dak To, I think, is so phenomenally important in the history of the war, and also as a paratrooper. Yeah, it's very likely he would have been there, probably with the one of the 503rd would be my guess. Anyway, so at the same time, though, too, remember they make that statement, Mean Debbie loves grunts, and she's the madam of the place. And you can see she treats these soldiers really well. So there's some kind of bond that she has with them. There's the other, you remember, and they're in that river position too. Mm-hmm. And there's Vietnamese just kind of hanging out with them. And of course, then they're caught in a crossfire, which is incredibly
tragic. And Vance
tragic.
is giving them vaccines.
Yeah. Giving them vaccines. Exactly. And so like the med caps, right? Wait, it's like, that's exactly what a medic would have been doing in that kind of stand down situation. This is going on throughout the war. And so there's a kind of a relationship there, kind of a bond, but also there's a little leeriness too, because I think for some Vietnamese who tend to be pro-American, the whole question is, are these guys going to stay? And what will happen if they don't? How do we deal with this? And then, of course, there's others who maybe don't want the Americans there. So I really like how they handled that versus maybe Platoon, where you don't get any sense of the Vietnamese there, except that we're, committing atrocities against them. I mean, that's kind of it. And so I think it's really, I think in this film, it's probably more genuinely portrayed only in the sense of how a GI would have perceived it and probably experienced it. Because most of these guys didn't commit atrocities. They didn't have very deep relationships with the locals or whatever. And they didn't know a lot about the culture, but they got along okay, when they did encounter, it wasn't one of their main preoccupation, weirdly, on some levels too. So,
but also this film is very much a sort of a clean war film in the sense that like the battle scenes are conventional force against conventional force. Mm-hmm. It's not search and destroy. It's not walking through villages. Yeah. So they don't have the opportunity, as it were, to behave badly mm-hmm. with civilians in the way that Oliver Stone presents us in Platoon. So I mean, I think that's what's interesting about this film too, is it's, on the one hand, it's obviously sort of countercultural, and it's about all the challenges of American society in the war, but it's also very much a sort of classic war film of like, take the hill, don't take the hill. Without a lot of plot, honestly, there's not much overarching plot in terms of like what's going to happen in the mission, which I think is actually, for me, it spoke to me because it's this idea of sort of the guys on the ground, they're just in the meat grinder, and that's what you get once they go in the Ashall Valley and they're going up the hill. It's just kind of relentless meat grinder without many plot points, because that's what it is. It just go up the hill and down the hill and go up the hill again, and that's it.
No, it feels at times, you bring up a good point, Wait, like it feels sometimes like this film is almost like a stage play, because it's very dialogue-y. It's very discourse, and like, the battle at the end almost feels, I don't want to say anticlimactic, because we've been building towards the battle.
It is but it's like, I think it's totally.
But it's like the whole film is about, are these guys going to get along? Can these guys figure each other out to go fight this war?
I think that's one tension, but I think the other tension is also who's going to survive.
The answer is
because
don't get attached to anybody in this film.
But that's it. But that's it though. You get the foreshadowing in the beginning of Mac, the guy who wants to go home, but is doing his job and beyond his job and gets killed doing it. But and then you have sort of the meet the platoon, as it were, and get to like them. And then it's the battle, and the tension for the viewer is a lot of which of my favorite characters are going to get killed, and the answer is like almost all of them.
Don't get attached is really what this film does.
Well, it's like a Greek tragedy in the end. The way they get killed, lingually stabbed to death. I mean, that'd be so rare as to be almost almost impossible. And then you see Michael Oatman's character, Motown. He's fallen this horrible punji trap, and he's just
laying there.
Done. And then Worcester up on the ridgeline coming back. I mean, these are unlikely scenarios in that context. But I guess the point is maybe the actual bloodbath and sacrifice. Maybe that.
It's also kind of like I think it's a great point, John, because it's also kind of like a melange of all the different ways you could get killed in Vietnam. You know what I mean? Because like the punji sticks thing is a great example of that. Because like chances are, on the hillside, where they have built-in bunkers and stuff, they're not gonna. That's just not because that's designed for like you're on patrol and you're walking through the jungle and you step in the wrong place. But it's kind of like we're gonna show you that one, and we're gonna show you we're gonna show you the sort of ferocity of the battle by throwing in hand-to-hand combat, which is, as you point out, like very, very rare. But it's standing in for telling the viewer this is ferocious. In a way that shooting, I suppose, is.
Does Doc survive? I never know at the end. Like I get the sense that he passes right there as they're waiting to get him out. Am I right?
I do too. I think he dies there, right? Don't you think so?
I do too.
He's all doped up, but I think he dies.
I was hoping that would be the case. Was not the case.
Because it took me a few viewings to come to the same conclusion, Jason, because I had always thought, well, I guess he gets medevaced, and who knows? But actually, it fits with the story a little more because you basically see Doc. He has that moment of recognition in his eyes, like, oh man, I'm in trouble here. You can tell that, and then they kind of cover him up, and then you see Valesky's reaction. Oh, it's incredible.
The acting is just phenomenal.
Just
Fences, by the way, is what I was trying to think of a moment ago. The stage play, and then later on the film. We talk about like how this film does not really, in a lot of ways, humanize the NVA because we don't get a chance to know any of them. But we do get one name. We get Han. We see Han early in the film, and France is like, "Look, you better take this dude seriously because he's going to murder you in your sleep." So here's my question, John. Like, what's Han doing there? And also, what's the American disposition? Because we hear all of these really horrific names to dehumanize the enemy in this war and any other war, I think, right? France has a very high respect for this dude and for the North Vietnamese. Is that the case by 1969, or the Americans know that they're in for a dogfight? Like, I don't.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, Nathaniel Victor and all that for sure. I mean, and by 1969, somebody of France's experience, they would very much respect the NVA because remember, they're not. I think Waitman mentioned this before. These aren't ragtag guys out there with a bolt-action rifle sniping at you or something, or laying mines and booby traps here and there. These are very well trained and equipped and armed soldiers who have been infiltrated south. And have a lot of tricks of the trade, and they know their stuff, and they fight really hard. So what I love about that scene is it's making a kind of soldier's commentary on a program that was really quite substantial in the war, the Chu Hoi program.
What is this?
Which was so the Chu Hoi program was an amnesty program for Viet Cong and NVA, saying come in, you can basically start a new life. And this program really existed, and there were tens of thousands who rallied to the Chu Hoi program. Most of them are Viet Cong, not NVA. Most of the NVA who are in custody have been captured on a battlefield somewhere. But leave that aside. It was a program in which you would basically start a new life. And the Vietnamese government and the American government would basically set you up with money. You could get land. You could go back to your original village and start over there. You could go somewhere else. People started businesses, but there were about 10 to 15% who then worked with the American Armed Forces, usually what was called Kit Carson Scouts. Like recon scouts with American units, who obviously these guys could figure things out the Americans often couldn't. And so Han has apparently, as Sergeant France, in the typical NCO cynicism that I love so much, he's come in on the Chu Hoi program to fatten up on sea rations, and then he'll be back out there hunting your young asses in the Aishao Valley. That's the way France would have viewed it. That's not the way the Chu Hoi program usually played out, though, believe it or not. Now, some people came in as shams. That's exactly right, or infiltrated. There was corruption. I mean, this is South Vietnam, after all, where some people posed as VC to get the money or cut deals with locals. Yeah, all true. But in the broad sweep, like looking at it as an historian, it was a reasonably successful program, decent, but from France's point of view, Han is just there to basically gather intel on the Americans, I guess. And I love how they do this, because you can see, that he's got his finger. I think he's got an RPG, if I remember correctly. And then, you're like, oh, what's he going to do here? And he has that grin, and you're just like, oh, crap. And it's a great way for France to get his new guys to take this whole thing seriously. And then Languili's like giggling through the whole thing. I've never understood that.
Alphabet. Yeah.
I don't know if it was just nervousness or what. I don't know what you guys think, but I was like, dude, why are you laughing through this? This is pretty serious business here.
Can I bring up my other thing? Which we're talking about portrayal, like you said, like the classic NCO, right? And this is my bugaboo, right? I was an Army officer.
Waiting for this conversation to come up.
Once again, man, the officers in these Vietnam movies, like, to a man,
incompetent,
are either just like non-entities or completely, immaterial or stupid. And I thought it was really interesting. And I'm going to go on a mini rant, but not a big one. But if you look at the casualties, on Hamburger Hill, officers they're up there leading by example. They're leading from the front. They're getting killed because they're out there doing this. And what's really interesting, because I went down the rabbit hole for this, for you guys, just for listeners, this is how much I love you. I went down this massive rabbit hole. And so the battalion commander was a guy named Weldon Honeycutt. Mm-hmm. And in the film, he sort of comes off as this guy who's in a helicopter. He's hovering above the battlefield, sort of just chewing up the guys because he wants to take the hill. He's out of touch. He has no idea what's going on. Well, this guy, his command post on day one of the battle, his battalion command post gets shot up by an American helicopter, and he is wounded, which he basically kills. It kills like most of his command team or incapacitates them. And he sort of shrugs it off and says, I'm not being evacuated. And then he's wounded again by friendly fire, believe it or not. And he stays there on the ground. He's on the ground, even though he was a helicopter company commander his first tour of Vietnam. He's on the ground, and the reason that he keeps his men there at the end, because that's a plot point, is like, is he wants them to be able to go to climb the hill and be on the top of the hill. He doesn't want them to be evacuated and let another battalion take the hill, because ultimately it's the 3rd of the 187th Battalion that does most of the fighting, but there are other battalions there as well, because the hill itself is actually kind of like, I've heard it described as kind of like a starfish, right, with these multiple ridges. And so there are battalions sort of all over the place who were supposed to kind of help the 3rd Battalion, but they never actually they just can't link up because they're in their own fight. So anyway, like, he comes off in the film as this sort of, really sort of callous guy with the stereotype of like the 3 different helicopters at different levels, which is like the battalion commander, the brigade commander, and the division commander, and they're all sort of circling on top of each other, watching the battle. But actually, in his case, it wasn't true. And obviously, I listened to some survivors, some veterans, company commanders, they all got wounded. Like, they all got shot. They're all out there on the ground. It's very much a sergeant's battle, because the distances are just nothing, but it's also a lieutenant's battle, and it's a platoon. And so I thought it wasn't as bad as some Vietnam movies. It wasn't as bad as Platoon, where you
can talk about casualties of war too. Wait, you've been dying to bring it up.
Yeah, well, No, but I mean, like the platoon leader in this, I think I'll give it credit, because in this film, the platoon leader is still pretty much a useless person, but he does have an arc from when he first gets to the platoon. There's a moment where they've come down the hill at one point, and the platoon sergeant basically walks over and gives him a cup of coffee. And like most people might not see this, but as somebody that's been in the army, I was like, that's the moment. Like that's the moment that like the platoon sergeant's like, I respect you, sir. Like you've sort of earned your stripes, as it were, and like we are now partners in this. Whereas in the beginning, he's kind of standing there while the platoon sergeant is basically telling the squads what to do and where to go and all this kind of stuff. So I mean, I appreciated that, even though at the very end, he gets killed, on the radio, but.
He survived. He just lost his arm, I think.
Yeah, he just lost his arm.
I mean, I know he lost his arm.
Scene, he's like, because Cheeto's like, sir, your arm, and he goes, oh, oh, yeah, it's this crazy look on his face, like.
Yeah, I think Lieutenant Edens comes off pretty well.
He comes off better.
He's a new guy, fresh as palm olive soap, and Worcester has to bring him along, and they bump into each other the first day of the operation. Doing okay, sir, and I thought, okay, he's kind of mentoring him a little bit. And then, but yeah, I had the same impression, Wade, that, can I buy you a cup of coffee, sir? That, okay, you're worth my, solicitousness here for a moment. And then Edens wants to go over the map, said, drink your coffee, sir. I love that, how it's just like, don't worry, you have it covered, I have it covered, it's okay. But I had the sense that Edens was very dedicated, that he was honest. He's briefing the guys on, writing letters home and all the other things available to them that an officer should be doing. And then he has the level of dedication later, when you remember the scene where, they can't resupply us, what? Get back on the radio, tell them my people need X, Y, and Z now, not later. And I thought that was a great moment, because it's like, okay, this dude's pushing back against hire, standing up for his people. You don't see any selfishness in him at all, the way you do in some other officers portrayed in these movies. And the thing about, I'm glad you made that point about Honeycutt, because he was absolutely dedicated to this. He has the call sign Blackjack, and they put that in there. Blackjack's going to get all of my people killed. And that's a real quote from someone who was there, and that was their impression of it. Maybe not really fair. And then Blackjack wants this hill. What's he going to do? Pave it over and turn it into a parking lot. There's, the whole futility of this thing. But there was actually supposedly like a price out on his head in the aftermath of this battle. And I don't know that had any weight to it or whatever, but there's no question he and his company commanders are extremely dedicated. They lead from the front, and I think so. I think Edens is portrayed as that. What I'm always wondering is who's the company commander, and you kind of you hear him on the radio. But
in the film, there's one officer that you see as a person. And again, this isn't like Waitman's officer affirmative action. Like I get it. Like an officer's not the be all and end all. But there's sort of the platoon leader, who I think John's right, goes on this arc that's actually it's subtle, but if you know what you're looking for, you can see it. There's the big beginning with the general who has the trailer, right? So there's like the sort of out of touch officer with like the trailer in Vietnam that everyone's shooting at, which is actually kind of hilarious, to be honest.
It really is.
And then like the disembodied voice from the helicopter, but you don't see. And I guess at a certain level that's accurate, because these guys probably didn't see their company commander very often, and we're not, and I guess that's part of it, is that their interaction, their leadership is predominantly NCOs, as it always has been, as it should be. Like these are the guys that lead. But at some point, I was listening to this guy named his last name was Baylor, James Baylor. He was in the 3rd 187th, and he said that it was on the 18th, so this is like day 8 of the battle, where they're getting ready to kind of crest the hill, and they're moving out of the cover to the area that had been just annihilated by air and artillery. And it's him and literally like 6 other guys, to include the platoon leader, and they're breaking cover together, and they all got shot, like all of them. and the platoon leader's there, and I mean, that's, like that's the infantry thing is, ultimately that's what junior leaders have to do in the infantry, to include NCOs who do it mostly. And let's not take any credit away from them, but the lieutenant is expected to sort of do that as well.
And so to me, if the film has a blind spot, it's on Arvin, because Arvin was a big factor in that fight historically, in the real Hamburger Hill fight, and they're completely ignored. And if I were an Arvin soldier who fought there, I'd be really ticked off about this movie, honestly, because you're not in there at all. And they had an absolutely key role.
John, for people who don't know about Arvin, you want to explain to our listeners what Arvin stood for and who they were?
Yeah, so that stood for Army of the Republic of Vietnam, basically the South Vietnamese Army. And it had been created when South Vietnam is created in the 1950s. So they obviously are going to have a major role in this war, and did through the whole thing. It took much heavier casualties than did the Americans. They come out of the war with a kind of a bad reputation for corruption, inefficiency, backwardness, which I don't think is altogether fair. It's an army with warts. It's an army that's better probably than we remember historically, but it's an army that ultimately wasn't good enough. I mean, maybe that's the way to view it fairly, I suppose. But in terms of what actually happened in this real historical battle, Arvin was really heavily involved and takes the lead in capturing some of the key objectives. And as they see it, in a way, they're the ones who capture the hill as they see it. I wasn't there, so I'm not going to say who's right or wrong or whatever. And they were all there, they were all part of this fight, including 3rd 187th that took the lead on so many levels and took a lot of the brunt of the casualties. But if that's one of the biggest things I would criticize about this movie, is that there's just no sense at all that Arvin's part of it. And I know that when it came out in the late 1980s, a lot of the Vietnamese community of people, former Arvin soldiers, many of them who are now living in the United States, were not terribly thrilled with it.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, one of the things that we see in, say, this film, we see it in Platoon, we see it a smaller extent maybe in Full Metal Jacket, is we see white soldiers, we see black soldiers, and they're part of that discourse in the 1980s about the war. And there's all this different stuff about class and race being presented in, say, all three of those films, plus the other films that we've seen. But we really don't see Arvin. And I just wonder if it's like we only have so much. We have 2 hours to show a film. There's only so much we can get on screen. And I think we see a little bit in what We Were Soldiers, but not very, even then, not very much.
I mean, I'm thinking the sort of trilogy we were talking about today: Platoon, Hamburger Hill, Full Metal Jacket. If I'm just sort of going by memory here, I can think of one portrayal of Arvin, and it's not particularly positive. Right. It's basically the guy who's a pimp in Full Metal Jacket, whom they obviously don't respect at all and mock, and they ultimately conclude the deal by saying, "We'll be glad to sell you some Arvin rifles, never been fired and only dropped once," and that's like the burn, and that's it, And I'm just saying, if I'm an Arvin soldier, I'm not too happy about that, because I'm in the war for the duration. The Americans can be there for 1 year and then they rotate home. So I've got to deal with the Viet Cong and the NVA. It's my life and my country for years. So maybe my pace of operations is not going to be what you'd like as an American, but I'm going to try and survive too. So, I mean, it's all in the perspective, I guess. And Arvin had its warts, of course. I'm not really trying to say otherwise, but I don't know that these are really good portrayals that can help our understanding much.
Well, and there's so many examples, particularly early on in the war, but also later, where you have American advisors who are embedded essentially in these Arvin units, and everybody, Arvin included, are fighting amazingly and being heroic, and you can read these, citations of the stories, and they're not all awful, they're not all terrible, but they also are not all American professional military. Though to the extent to which the Army in Vietnam is professional is in some ways diluted by all of the draftees as well. So,
yeah. John, you have this encyclopedic knowledge of war films, not just with Vietnam, but all these other conflicts as well. And I'm kind of wondering, do you know anything about Vietnamese cinema? Are you familiar with I'm wondering, does Vietnam, do does Vietnam go back and memorialize this conflict in their own arts world as well? If you're familiar with this, have you seen that at all?
I mean, not on my radar screen.
I'd be interested to see.
I mean, nothing really stands out that much except how they do portray the war historically is certainly not friendly to American interpretations. The Americans are basically imperialists who came and tried to occupy their country and unleashed atrocities, and that's kind of it. I mean,
I'm sitting here going, okay, yep. As a guy who studies American, who studies indigenous folks here in the United States, I go, okay. All right, here's my history buff question for you, John, and for you, Wait. And I prepped you on this because we get this a lot, and sometimes the history buff gets the bad rap in historical circles. I love history buffs. Like, if you got questions about the little minutia of stuff, I want to talk to you about it. Like, I think it's cool that you think it's cool. Mm-hmm. We see Boletsky throw down his weapon in favor of the AK-47. I think he's out of ammo, but he picks up that AK-47 and that thing's coated in mud and fires on a dime. Like, can we talk a little bit about the M16 versus the Kalashnikov? What do you like? Like, what is this super weapon that is everywhere?
Well, I mean, the AK-47 had the reputation as never, ever, ever jamming. And, I mean, obviously there's a lot of truth to that. So here's a complete mud ball of a battlefield. I agree, Jason. That was my interpretation, that Boletsky runs out of ammo. There's the next weapon, and the AK is that, is likely to fire in that situation. You grab whatever weapon you got. Boletsky has become, by the way, a really hardcore, high-speed combat soldier by this point in time. So I think he's an interesting dude, too, because, I mean, he's, I guess, a salesman back in the world. He's, I guess he's engaged, too. He really has a whole life there. And, he's very diligent, isn't he? Remember, he's the guy who's always worrying.
Yep.
Boletsky, do you stay up at night wondering what you should be worrying about? I love that little zinger. That's so wonderful. But I think the AK-47 obviously is a tremendous weapon, and the impression of some soldiers was that the communists had an advantage with the AK because it was a little more durable, and it had the 30-round clip, whereas you'd probably have 18 in your M16 magazine because it might jam with 20.
Well, and of course, one of the challenges with the M16 is my M16 in the 21st century had, semi-automatic and 3-round burst as my options. But an M16 in Vietnam had a full auto. And you actually see that in the very beginning, the first firefight, where the dudes are just putting their rifle up, holding the trigger, and that's it, you're done.
Yep.
And, for light infantry, ammunition is very, very heavy. And if you go through an entire magazine in 1 second or 3 seconds or whatever, you run out of ammunition very, very quickly. I think honestly, the more interesting weapon, if we're talking about weapons, the more interesting weapon in that movie is the M60, because ironically, this is admittedly a
you were waiting for that,
but
I was waiting for this one.
At one moment, you literally see the NVA shooting M60s because I guess that's the only machine gun they had available when they're filming it, which makes no sense, but. The M60 is a really fascinating weapon because it is essentially a child of the Nazi MG42 and FG42, which are the some of the most deadly machine guns in modern history. But the M60 had we'll say a mixed reception. There are guys that love it. Most of the guys didn't have to carry it around. If you ever carried an M60 on a patrol, it's no fun. It kicks your ass very, very quickly. But it's really interesting because the M60 gunners had a very, very, very short lifespan on the Vietnam battlefield. They were right there with radio operators and lieutenants on actually. And there's a firefight. They begin to lay suppressive fire, and the enemy goes for them immediately. Mm-hmm. And so these guys get killed a lot. And the M60 is a really pain in the ass because there in Vietnam, there was no really great way to carry the ammunition. So an M60 has three guys in the team. It has the gunner, it has the assistant gunner, and then basically a mule who carries all the ammunition. But there wasn't, as today you have sort of like these drums and these like slings with the ammunition in boxes, and it really wasn't like that. So you know, you would see the guys with it like draped over them like Rambo. But the problem is that gets very dirty, and it causes the machine the weapon to jam. And so M60 had a very, very bad reputation for jamming or overheating in the middle of a firefight. And they hadn't figured out yet to put a guard around the barrel. So in the middle of a firefight, you'd have to reach over and basically grab a steaming hot barrel to change the barrels out. And there are lots of examples of soldiers in Vietnam, M60 gunners, burning their hands because they don't have the asbestos glove, to hand to grab the barrel off. And I've seen some really interesting, like, soldiers find a way, right? So, there was an example that they tried to use a feeder chute from a helicopter, and they basically put the ammunition in a backpack, and the guy had like a feeder chute going into the weapon to try to keep the links clean, right? Because that's the problem. Mm-hmm. And like a good M60 gunner would have to clean his weapon way more often than anybody else. Mm-hmm. And they would jam so frequently, and or overheat so frequently that a good M60 gunner would be firing the gun, and he would wait to start to hear the rounds cook off, which meant that the barrel was too hot. And you could sort of hear when a round is essentially exploding in the barrel. It's not being necessarily hit in the primary; it's actually exploding. And they would get good enough; they could sort of like, now I need to change the barrel. But I thought it was interesting, in the film, the 60 gunner is obviously a central part of the platoon, and then his little minion, like the guy who is amazing. That guy, like, he's a little guy, but he a little dude. But when it's his turn, he grabs that pig and is humping it with the best of them.
Is that the most tragic death?
My little journey in M60.
Gagan's, yeah, it certainly is for Doc.
Yeah.
It is for Doc.
Doc loses his mind when Gagans dies.
Yeah. Gagan seems like a very universally liked guy,
like a sweet kind of guy, Yeah. John, what happens after the Americans finally take this hill? Like you talked, I mean, and how is that different than say Dacto, or is it the same result? Like
pretty much.
What happens here? Like we take the hill and then is it reoccupied almost immediately? Like what happens here?
Yeah, it's reoccupied shortly thereafter. The Americans, take the hill, they move on in search of the NVA, wherever they may be. And the same pattern repeats. The communists come back, and we're back in the same place. What is a little different this time versus Dacto is that this time there's this enormous kind of political outrage and domestic outrage over this that Hamburger Hill seems to those who oppose the war as being the classic example of what's wrong with the war and what a terrible waste. And, Waitman mentioned earlier the Life magazine cover. There's an impression, of course, that these guys have all been killed on Hamburger Hill, and that only adds to this fury and momentum. And the reference to Senator Kennedy, for instance, who's certainly not referred to well, I don't think Senator Kennedy was quite saying you guys can't take this hill. I think he was saying you guys shouldn't take this hill. It's two different kind of concepts, so I think that's an interesting scene because it portrays like the soldier resentment against the politicians back home kind of thing, and also the media. The media is portrayed terribly there, of that really out of touch reporter talking to these guys. But one of the soldiers even says to him, "What are you doing here?" Well, I mean, I'm sorry, that's right where media really should be. Maybe not quite the way this guy is.
Yeah, France chews him out.
I was unclear whether those were military reporters, and that there was an element of like, you're not a real soldier, like you're not a combat soldier. So like, I was unclear exactly what they're.
I think he's supposed to be a civilian who's in the military garb, but shouldn't be maybe. And they have such contempt for him. And yet I also think, well, he's at least there in the proximity. He's not back in Saigon where a lot of them would have been. But he's not embedded either, which is if you really wanted to report well on a unit in that era, that's what you do. And the best ones, the John Lawrences of the world, that's what they tended to do, and I think did it very, very well. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting, that kind of contempt for the media that you see there. I think spoke to a lot of Vietnam veterans at the time, who many of whom had those resentments they had built up. We weren't allowed to win the war. The media cost us win the war. All these kinds of things.
Wasn't
some people,
John, wasn't there, and forgive me here, but like, isn't that markedly different than, say, than like World War II? There was a media journalist who dies in the Pacific, if I recall correctly, and I can't remember.
Ernie
Thank
Pyle.
you. Right. And his loss is reverberates. I mean, he's mourned. Am I correct?
Oh, big time. Yeah. So Ernie Pyle is unique in the sense that he is the kind of guy who was always with soldiers. And wrote very movingly about the average soldier. And I'm saying soldier kind of ubiquitously, service people. And so, yeah, he was beloved because he's giving you these human interest stories. Now, he himself is very fair-minded in terms of race, but he really tended to be associated with whites. I mean, there was even segregation in media coverage back then. So that's one thing that would be a little different than in Vietnam. But I will say this too: in World War II, especially a lot of combat soldiers weren't always that wild about media, because they would think, these guys, I read these stories, it's always wrong, or I don't know who they talk to, but it's BS. They don't seem to talk to soldiers, or they don't give credit to our unit, or So in Vietnam, I think the resentments would have been similar to that, but also they're here, stirring up anti-war sentiment or pro-war sentiment, depending on where you were as a GI. Because remember, a lot of these GIs are not too wild about the war themselves, and France refers to that. Remember, he says, a lot of you demonstrated in school, you were peace, whatever, on your steel and all this kind of stuff. So you can see this playing out. So I think that in this case, the encounter with the media there portrays a concept in a way as old as modern media itself, the kind of ghoul or vulture mentality that, if you're a real combat soldier in the middle of this fight, you come out of there and here's somebody wanting to ask these kind of intimate questions who's so obviously out of touch and doesn't know how to talk to soldiers. There's a natural kind of contempt and divide there that it's very hard to overcome. And so that's why John Lawrence, someone like him, is living there with these guys, so that goes away. Now you become, part of them on some level too, which is difficult as a reporter then to try and have your objectivity as well. And so it's hard to bridge that
Who
gap.
was it at Ia Drang?
Joe Galloway.
Thank you.
I met him once. He's an amazing guy.
Oh, really? What was that like?
I forget where it was. It was the same. I think I was a cadet, and we went to this Vietnam symposium. And I met Oliver Stone there too. And Oliver Stone was an asshole.
Shocking.
Oh, really?
Surprisingly.
What did he do?
I asked him for like an autograph or something, and he like told me to fuck off or something, that kind of thing. But Joe Galloway was amazing. I mean, he's such a soft-spoken guy, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. He always had this kind of, when he talked about the Ia Drang, he always had this kind of like moist look in his eyes. Like you could tell that it was really a thing. Like he was in there. Like, I mean, he talks about this is an aside, I guess, but it gets back to the one of the things you mentioned was friendly fire, and that one of the things that Joe Galloway, I think, always took with him and never once forgot was the Japanese American soldier who had been terribly burned by napalm. He'd literally met the guy, like in the film. That legit happened completely. That's completely true. He met this guy and he was like talking to him about like his life and his family back home, et cetera, et cetera. And then short round of the napalm, and the guy's legs are coming off in his hands as he's trying to evacuate him. And I think that there's a guy who's embedded. I mean, that's like above and beyond embedded. He's actually pulling triggers at one point. So like. He is in that fight, but what I always thought was interesting about him is that the members of the 7th Cavalry, veterans of Ia Drang, basically treated him like a veteran. Like he would go to their reunions. he wore a Stetson, and you know me, I'm the first guy to regulate the wearing of the Stetson if you're not, but in his case, no way. Like he was there, he was doing it, and the veterans of 1-7 and 2-7, I suppose too, he was one of their own in a way that I've never seen other civilians sort of adopted in that way.
Most of our characters here are fictionalized characters to survive, taking place in this battle. So, of the guys who survived, gentlemen, what happens to Boletsky in France? And I can't recall Don Cheadle's character's name. Do any of these guys Washburn? Thank you. Have you ever thought like your counterfactuals, like what happens? Does Boletsky make it? Because these guys are trying to make it a year, and then you're thrown into this hill this early on. How do you survive another 10 months or whatever?
Yeah.
In your mind, it's like you take a guy like Worcester, and almost like Barnes and Platoon. This guy could survive anything. So with his loss is just shakes you to your, I have to imagine, to your soul here.
Bonds ain't meant to die.
Only kill Bonds. God.
The only person that killed Bonds is Bonds.
It says Bonds instead of Barnes.
I love Platoon.
Yeah, I get the sense that last shot, I think it's meant to be quite iconic, kind of like the memorial, the statues in DC, which is so cool. I think the three guys there and everything, kitted out the way they would have been. And so I think I always thought that's sort of supposed to reflect that. But if we think about what's going to happen to these guys going forward, the odds are not really with them.
What happens to 101st?
France could. I mean, the 101st is going to stay there for, I think until the end of 70 or beginning of 71. And they have this fight called Operation or either Firebase or Operation Ripcord. That's actually going to be a losing fight, and that's in 1970. Goodness. I think I could be wrong, but so there's plenty of fighting ahead, and there's plenty of humping that you're going to have to do in the Aishau Valley after this, and so no, there's not much relief from it unless you're combat wounded, which they aren't. France maybe could get out of it in a way because maybe he's short and about to go home. I don't know. It seems like maybe he would be. Boletsky is probably going to be one of these bellwether guys they're going to have to rely on when you rebuild the unit, and Washburn too. Yeah.
I mean, I love this question, Jason, because all movies, like they sort of have their climax, right? And the good guys win at some level, and we all file to the exits. But like war isn't like that, and you see, for example, all these times people who survive iconic, like D-Day, or survived Pearl Harbor, or survived the sinking of a battleship or whatever, and then goes on and gets killed later on in the war. Like because the war keeps going. Like it's not like the
war doesn't care where you fought.
We're like, all right, cool, But like it's like, oh my gosh, this person was like the only survivor, one of the few survivors of, say, the Indianapolis getting sunk in World War II, and then gets sunk again and dies.
John Bazelon, man.
So I mean, John Bazelon's a great example, or lots of Medal of Honor winners, who win the Medal of Honor doing one thing, and then, their luck runs out later on. So it's a great question, sort of think about, these guys survived this big thing, but then, I mean, I literally was listening to that same guy, the veteran Baylor, and he was like, yeah, like he was talking to these guys, and he said, we survived. I survived the Hamburger Hill, but I still had 6 months left to go, and it's like, I mean, I don't think any of those guys were like, hooray, I survived this battle and I'm good to go for, the rest of the war.
Well, there's that great shot of is it John McGinley at the end of Platoon, where after they come out, he's like,
congratulations, you're the platoon sergeant.
Right.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
He's like, oh,
I'm doing just fine, sir.
Well,
that's good.
You got
the second platoon.
There you go.
Oh, seriously. And he already wanted out before the fight. He had the bad feeling, you remember?
Yeah.
Guys, I feel like we could talk about this film for like another 2.5, 3 hours, but I don't want to do that.
Easily.
I feel like we could just go on and on and on about Vietnam films, and maybe we'll be able to come back and do another 1 or 5 or whatever. But for now, because I actually have Matthew Davis's new book called Biography of a Mountain, A History of Mount Rushmore on my desk that I'm talking about later this week, maybe we can talk about your Mount. And I hate doing the Mount Rushmore stuff, but we're going to do it anyway. What's your Mount Rushmore of Vietnam films? John, you were here first. What do you got?
Well, I think we've talked about them today. Do we get? Does that mean we get three?
We
or
get four.
I mean,
we get four. We'll get four in an honorable mention. How's that? I'll give you 5.
Yeah, I mean, We Were Soldiers, I think, has to be on there. I really like, even there's some things that are really inaccurate about it, but I really like the portrayal of the leadership dynamic. Joe Galloway, played by Barry Pepper. I just think it's a really good movie showing soldiers in a bad situation on both sides. By the way, the NVA is humanized a little bit more than we have seen in that movie. Another really tough movie, but I think a good one is Rescue Dawn.
Oh yeah, that's tough.
Portrays Dieter, the downed naval aviator who ends up
poor
in
Steve
captivity.
Zahn, right? Is it Steve Zahn? Is the other guy? Yeah,
Steve Zahn is in that movie, and obviously Christian Bale. And there could be inaccuracies because mainly we're going on one or two people's account there because of the situation being as horrible as it was. So I take that in account, but still, I hadn't
thought about that one.
Yeah, it's a tough movie to watch, honestly, because I think in a way that's partly what makes it good, because it's true to what it was. I mean, just in case you haven't seen it, it portrays a naval aviator who actually was born in Germany, and then comes to the U.S. and becomes an American citizen, and is shot down, and he's basically captured not necessarily by the VC, but by the Pathet Lao, which is communist Laotian militia. And so he isn't even cycled up to Hanoi like a lot of POWs. He's in the middle of this mess, and he's there with a downed Air Force guy, played by Steve Zahn, and then I guess an Air America guy played by Jeremy Davies, who played Upham in Saving Private Ryan, and then some other Vietnamese guys, or maybe they're even Montagnards too. It's never really clear. So it's worth seeing, but it's not. You're not going to come out of that in a good mood. Dieter Dangler, that was the guy's name.
There you go. All right, you got two or three. Give me. Are we putting up Full Metal Jacket and Platoon as the other ones there, John?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean they have to be, don't they? I mean Platoon has to be there. It's just it is the iconic Vietnam War film, and I had some criticism of it before, but it's also brilliant, I think, on many levels as well. I think Hamburger Hill has to be there, and Full Metal Jacket. I mean, gosh, we could really go into a lot of dimensions of that one. Obviously, it's really interesting in a lot of aspects of it, but just one little anecdote. A Vietnam veteran whom I knew when I was a doctoral candidate at Tennessee, who I got to know, and he told me that he and his Marine buddies from Vietnam veterans, all of them, they would get together every year and just watch the first half of the movie, the boot camp part, because it was, I guess, so true to their experiences. Maybe not the end point of the suicide, the murder-suicide situation, but it was so true and so affecting to them that they watched that part. The rest of it wasn't as true to their experience because they were there. These guys were there like in '66. They wouldn't have been involved in an urban battle or anything. But that I thought, that speaks well to a movie in a way. These are real guys who were there, that they were willing to kind of prioritize that in their lives every year as some sort of an established thing. And that really intrigued me.
Wait, what you got?
Well, so the movie that, I think Platoon. I think Platoon is an incredible movie, and I like Platoon. Obviously, as a Vietnam movie, but also as a movie about atrocity and about how small groups of people react to and or participate in atrocities. I think it's a fantastic movie, from that perspective. We Were Soldiers is a great movie, but it's half of a movie, because they should have made a whole nother movie that includes 2-7, which was the other battalion of the Cav that was ambushed, and that's the unhappy side of the Yad Rang, because they got ambushed as they were making their way to an LZ, and there was lots of bravery there too, but it was pretty bloody. But the movie we haven't mentioned, which I'm kind of shocked, is Apocalypse Now. Which I think is a fantastic Vietnam movie, even though it's obviously it's a remake of Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad novel. But I think, in terms of sort of, I mean, obviously it's not documentary, right? But I mean, in terms of the feel and portraying the craziness, the nonsensical natures at times of war, in a Vietnam context, I think it has to be up there. I mean, I think you have to talk about Apocalypse Now. I mean, I think it's a fantastic film. I'm biased, I guess, but I love that one. But also another movie that I would mention, I think Good Morning Vietnam is.
We hear Kernauer
also a
in this film.
fantastic.
Yeah,
he's in the beginning. I mean, it's one of the guys. Kernauer wouldn't have been there by '69, but they have a clip of a similar guy because the people that followed him adopted the Good Morning Vietnam thing. I think that's actually, again, it's not super war like fighting, but again, I think it speaks to the nature of the war and the challenges of the war, and I think it very much something that we have talked about in this podcast. You know, it does humanize the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese they play a big role in that movie, and you see their perspective. You know, to include, you know, why are we joining the VC? You know, and I think that, so I think, you know, I think that I would add those to the already great examples given by John. So I'd add, you know, Platoon. I think, again, I think We Were Told is a fantastic movie. But then I'd add Apocalypse Now and Good Morning Vietnam.
I have one serious one and a couple others that are more thought pieces. Mine is Tigerland, which, did you guys see this one with Colin Farrell? Kind of, for his performance alone, I thought Farrell was really good in that. I mean, it's been years since I've seen it. I have a couple more ideas, you know, and I absolutely agree. I think my four have to be Platoon, Hamburger Hill, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now. I think that's it. I think that those are pretty obvious. But then also Southern Comfort. Have you seen this film? You guys know this film? It's a post Vietnam War film set in Louisiana, where a bunch of National Guard guys go to war against some Cajuns. And growing up in Brobridge, Louisiana, you can guess what side we were on as a child in the early 80s. And then I think there's some fascinating character studies about essentially the revenge fantasies, the missing in actions, the Rambo First Blood 2.
The Four Bloods? What is that? The Five Bloods? The movie that recently came out.
The Spike Lee one. Yep. So
I mean, it's funny because, like, Jason, I'm imagining, you know, like those alignment charts of, like, you know, doctrine neutral, doctrine radical, like where do you put Vietnam movies? Because you could also talk about Flight of the Intruder, right? Or even like Buffalo Soldiers, the movie, which is actually kind of about the army that happened after Vietnam and how messed up it was in a certain way. Right? I mean, so you could kind of, like, depending on how doctrine pure versus like doctrine radical you want to be about what constitutes a Vietnam movie, you could go in all kinds of, I mean, like Born on the 4th of July, you know, is again.
All right. We're now opening this up to 47 different podcasts. So we're going to call it now. Guys, thank you so very much for being here. This was awesome. I so much wanted to talk to both of you. John, I had the best time with you a few weeks ago. Wait, you're my boy. So, guys, thank you so much for being here. This was amazing.
It was a blast.
Happy to come.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guests, John McManus and Waitman Beorn, for being here today, guys. That was awesome. Please come back. We'll do it again. Thank you, of course, to my brother-in-arms, Fletcher Powell. Fletcher, I'll never leave you behind the lines. God, that's fucking awful. But thank you to all of you for being here and being part of the Reckoning with Jason Herbert community and continuing to help this podcast grow. We've got so many more episodes coming for you shortly, so keep being here, keep sharing this with friends. Hope you are happy, safe where you are, and we will catch you next time. Ciao for now.